Chapter 16 of Erewhon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neil Donnelly. Erewhon by Samuel Butler. Chapter 16. Erewhon. The reader will perhaps have learned by this time a thing which I had myself suspected before I had been 24 hours in Mr. Nosnibor's house. I mean that though the Nosnibors showed me every attention, I could not cordially like them, with the exception of Erewhon, who was quite different from the rest. They were not fair samples of Erewhonians. I saw many families with whom they were on visiting terms, whose manners charmed me more than I know how to say, but I never could get over my original prejudice against Mr. Nosnibor for having embezzled the money. Mrs. Nosnibor, too, was a very worldly woman, yet to hear her talk one would have thought that she was singularly the reverse. Neither could I endure Zulora. Erewhon, however, was perfection. She it was who ran all the little errands for her mother and Mr. Nosnibor and Zulora, and gave those thousand proofs of sweetness and unselfishness which some one member of a family is generally required to give. All day long it was Erewhon this and Erewhon that, but she never seemed to know that she was being put upon, and was always bright and willing from morning till evening. Zulora certainly was very handsome, but Erewhon was infinitely the more graceful of the two, and was the very ne plus ultra of youth and beauty. I will not attempt to describe her, for anything that I could say would fall so far short of the reality as only to mislead the reader. Let him think of the very loveliest that he can imagine, and he will still be below the truth. Having said this much, I need hardly say that I had fallen in love with her. She must have seen what I felt for her, but I tried my hardest not to let it appear even by the slightest sign. I had many reasons for this. I had no idea what Mr. and Mrs. Nosnibor would say to it, and I knew that Erewhon would not look at me, at any rate not yet, if her father and mother disapproved, which they probably would, considering that I had nothing except the pension of about £1 a day of our money which the king had granted me. I did not yet know of a more serious obstacle. In the meantime, I may say that I had been presented at court, and was told that my reception had been considered as singularly gracious. Indeed, I had several interviews both with the king and queen, at which from time to time the queen got everything from me I had in the world, clothes and all, except the 2 buttons I had given to Iram, the loss of which seemed to annoy her a good deal. I was presented with a court suit, and Her Majesty had my old clothes put upon a wooden dummy, on which they probably remain, unless they have been removed in consequence of my subsequent downfall. His Majesty's manners were those of a cultivated English gentleman. He was much pleased at hearing that our government was monarchical, and that the mass of the people were resolute that it should not be changed. Indeed, I was so much encouraged by the evident pleasure with which he heard me, that I ventured to quote to him those beautiful lines of Shakespeare's: "There's a divinity doth hedge a king, rough hew him how we may." But I was sorry I had done so afterwards, for I do not think His Majesty admired the lines as much as I could have wished. There is no occasion for me to dwell further upon my experience of the court, but I ought perhaps to allude to one of my conversations with the king, inasmuch as it was pregnant with the most important consequences. He had been asking about my watch, and inquiring whether such dangerous inventions were tolerated in the country from which I came. I owned with some confusion that watches were not uncommon, but observing the gravity which came over His Majesty's face, I presumed to say that they were fast dying out, and that we had few if any other mechanical contrivances of which he was likely to disapprove. Upon his asking me to name some of our most advanced machines, I did not dare to tell him of our steam engines and railroads and electric telegraphs, and was puzzling my brains to think what I could say, when, of all things in the world, balloons suggested themselves, and I gave him an account of a very remarkable ascent which was made some years ago. The king was too polite to contradict, but I felt sure that he did not believe me, and from that day forward, though he always showed me the attention which was due to my genius, for in this light was my complexion regarded, he never questioned me about the manners and customs of my country. To return, however, to Erewhon. I soon gathered that neither Mr. nor Mrs. Nosnibor would have any objection to my marrying into the family. Physical excellence is considered in Erewhon as a set-off against almost any other disqualification, and my light hair was sufficient to make me an eligible match. But along with this welcome fact, I gather another which filled me with dismay. I was expected to marry Zulora, for whom I had already conceived a great aversion. At first I hardly noticed the little hints and the artifices which were resorted to in order to bring us together, but after a time they became too plain. Zulora, whether she was in love with me or not, was bent on marrying me, and I gathered in talking with a young gentleman of my acquaintance who frequently visited the house and whom I greatly disliked, that it was considered a sacred and inviolable rule that whoever married into a family must marry the eldest daughter at that time unmarried. The young gentleman urged this upon me so frequently that I at last saw he was in love with Arowhena himself, and wanted me to get Zulora out of the way. But others told me the same story as to the custom of the country, and I saw there was a serious difficulty. My only comfort was that Arowhena snubbed my rival and would not look at him. Neither would she look at me. Nevertheless, there was a difference in the manner of her disregard. This was all I could get from her. Not that she avoided me. On the contrary, I had many tete-a-tete with her, for her mother and sister were anxious for me to deposit some part of my pension in the musical banks, this being in accordance with the dictates of their goddess Idgrun, of whom both Mrs. Nosnibor and Zulora were great devotees. I was not sure whether I had kept my secret from being perceived by Arowhena herself, but none of the others suspected me, so she was set upon me to get me to open an account, at any rate, pro forma with the musical banks, and I need hardly say that she succeeded. But I did not yield at once. I enjoyed the process of being argued with too keenly to lose it by a prompt concession. Besides, a little hesitation rendered the concession itself more valuable. It was in the course of conversations on this subject that I learned the more defined religious opinions of the Erewhonians, that coexist with the musical bank system, but are not recognized by those curious institutions. I will describe them as briefly as possible in the following chapters before I return to the personal adventures of Arowhena and myself. They were idolaters, though of a comparatively enlightened kind, but here, as in other things, there was a discrepancy between their professed and actual belief, for they had a genuine and potent faith which existed without recognition alongside of their idol worship. The gods whom they worship openly are personifications of human qualities, as justice, strength, hope, fear, love, etc., etc. The people think that prototypes of these have a real objective existence in a region far beyond the clouds, holding, as did the ancients, that they are like men and women both in body and passion, except that they are even comelier and more powerful, and also that they can render themselves invisible to human eyesight. They are capable of being propitiated by mankind, and of coming to the assistance of those who ask their aid. Their interest in human affairs is keen, and on the whole beneficent, but they become very angry if neglected, and punish rather the first they come upon than the actual person who has offended them, their fury being blind when it is raised, though never raised without reason. They will not punish with any less severity when people sin against them from ignorance, and without the chance of having had knowledge. They will take no excuse of this kind, but are even as the English law, which assumes itself to be known to every one. Thus they have a law that two pieces of matter may not occupy the same space at the same moment, which law is presided over and administered by the gods of time and space jointly, so that if a flying stone and a man's head attempt to outrage these gods by arrogating a right which they do not possess, for so it is written in one of their books, and to occupy the same space simultaneously, A severe punishment, sometimes even death itself, is sure to follow, without any regard to whether the stone knew that the man's head was there, or the head the stone. This, at least, is their view of the common accidents of life. Moreover, they hold their deities to be quite regardless of motives. With them it is the thing done which is everything, and the motive goes for nothing. Thus they hold it strictly forbidden for a man to go without common air in his lungs for more than a very few minutes, and if by any chance he gets into the water, the air god is very angry, and will not suffer it, no matter whether the man got into the water by accident or on purpose, whether through the attempt to save a child or through presumptuous contempt of the air god. The air god will kill him, unless he keeps his head high enough out of the water, and thus gives the air god his due. This with regard to the deities who manage physical affairs. Over and above these they personify hope, fear, love, and so forth, giving them temples and priests, and carving likenesses of them in stone, which they verily believe to be faithful representations of living beings, who are only not human in being more than human. If anyone denies the objective existence of these divinities, and says that there is really no such being as a beautiful woman called Justice, with her eyes blinded and a pair of scales, positively living and moving in a remote and ethereal region, but that Justice is only the personified expression of certain modes of human thought and action, they say that he denies the existence of Justice in denying her personality, and that he is a wanton disturber of men's religious convictions. They detest nothing so much as any attempt to lead them to higher spiritual conceptions of the deities whom they profess to worship. Arowhena and I had a pitched battle on this point, and should have had many more but for my prudence in allowing her to get the better of me. I am sure that in her heart she was suspicious of her own position, for she returned more than once to the subject. "Can you not see," I had exclaimed, "that the fact of Justice being admirable will not be affected by the absence of a belief in her being also a living agent? Can you really think that men will be one whit less hopeful because they no longer believe that hope is an actual person?" She shook her head, and said that with men's belief in the personality, all incentive to the reverence of the thing itself, as justice or hope, would cease. Men from that hour would never be either just or hopeful again. I could not move her, nor indeed did I seriously wish to do so. She deferred to me in most things, but she never shrank from maintaining her opinions if they were put in question, nor does she to this day abate one jot of her belief in the religion of her childhood, though in compliance with my repeated entreaties she has allowed herself to be baptized into the English Church. She has, however, made a gloss upon her original faith to the effect that her baby and I are the only human beings exempt from the vengeance of the deities for not believing in their personality. She is quite clear that we are exempted. She should never have so strong a conviction of it otherwise. How it has come about she does not know, neither does she wish to know. There are things which it is better not to know, and this is one of them. But when I tell her that I believe in her deities as much as she does, and that it is a difference about words, not things, she becomes silent with a slight emphasis. I own that she very nearly conquered me once, for she asked me what I should think if she were to tell me that my God, whose nature and attributes I had been explaining to her, was but the expression for man's highest conception of goodness, wisdom, and power, that in order to generate a more vivid conception of so great and glorious a thought, man had personified it and called it by name, that it was an unworthy conception of the deity to hold him personal, inasmuch as escape from human contingencies became thus impossible, that the real thing men should worship was the divine, whereinsoever they could find it, that God was but man's way of expressing his sense of the divine, that as justice, hope, wisdom, etc., were all parts of goodness, so God was the expression which embraced all goodness and all good power, that people would no more cease to love God on ceasing to believe in his objective personality, than they had ceased to love justice on discovering that she was not really personal. Nay, that they would never truly love him till they saw him thus. She said all this in her artless way, and with none of the coherence with which I have here written it. Her face kindled, and she felt sure that she had convinced me that I was wrong, and that justice was a living person. Indeed, I did wince a little, but I recovered myself immediately, and pointed out to her that we had books whose genuineness was beyond all possibility of doubt, as they were certainly none of them less than 1800 years old; that in these there were the most authentic accounts of men who had been spoken to by the Deity himself, and of one prophet who had been allowed to see the back parts of God through the hand that was laid over his face. This was conclusive, and I spoke with such solemnity that she was a little frightened, and only answered that they too had their books, in which their ancestors had seen the gods, on which I saw that further argument was not at all likely to convince her, and fearing that she might tell her mother what I had been saying, and that I might lose the hold upon her affections which I was beginning to feel pretty sure that I was obtaining, I began to let her have her own way, and to convince me. Neither till after we were safely married did I show the cloven hoof again. Nevertheless, her remarks have haunted me, and I have since met with many very godly people who have had a great knowledge of divinity, but no sense of the divine. And again, I have seen a radiance upon the face of those who were worshipping the divine either in art or nature, in picture or statue, in field or cloud or sea, in man, woman, or child, which I have never seen kindled by any talking about the nature and attributes of God. Mention but the word divinity, and our sense of the divine is clouded. End of chapter 16. Of Erewhon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neil Donnelly. Erewhon by Samuel Butler, Chapter 17. Idgrun and the Idgrunites. In spite of all the to-do they make about their idols, and the temples they build, and the priests and priestesses whom they support, I could never think that their professed religion was more than skin-deep. But they had another which they carried with them into all their actions, and although no one from the outside of things would suspect it to have any existence at all, it was in reality the great guide, the mariner's compass of their lives, so that there were very few things which they ever either did or refrained from doing without reference to its precepts. Now I suspected that their professed faith had no great hold upon them, firstly because I often heard the priests complain of the prevailing indifference, and they would hardly have done so without reason; secondly, because of the show which was made, for there was none of this about the worship of the goddess Idgrun, in whom they really did believe; thirdly, because, though the priests were constantly abusing Idgrun as being the great enemy of the gods, it was well known that she had no more devoted worshippers in the whole country than these very persons, who were often priests of Idgrun rather than of their own deities. Neither am I by any means sure that these were not the best of the priests. Idgrun certainly occupied a very anomalous position. She was held to be both omnipresent and omnipotent, but she was not an elevated conception, and was sometimes both cruel and absurd. Even her most devoted worshippers were a little ashamed of her, and served her more with heart and in deed than with their tongues. Theirs was no lip service; on the contrary, even when worshipping her most devoutly they would often deny her. Take her all in all, however, she was a beneficent and useful deity, who did not care how much she was denied so long as she was obeyed and feared, and who kept hundreds of thousands in those paths which make life tolerably happy, who would never have been kept there otherwise, and over whom a higher and more spiritual ideal would have had no power. I greatly doubt whether the Erewhonians are yet prepared for any better religion, and though, considering my gradually strengthened conviction that they were the representatives of the lost tribes of Israel, I would have set about converting them at all hazards had I seen the remotest prospect of success, I could hardly contemplate the displacement of Idgrun as the great central object of their regard without admitting that it would be attended with frightful consequences. In fact, were I a mere philosopher, I should say that the gradual raising of the popular conception of Ydgrun would be the greatest spiritual boon which could be conferred upon them, and that nothing could effect this except example. I generally found that those who complained most loudly that Ydgrun was not high enough for them had hardly as yet come up to the Ydgrun standard, and I often met with a class of men whom I called to myself high Ydgrunites, the rest being Ydgrunites and low Ydgrunites, who, in the matter of human conduct and the affairs of life, appeared to me to have got about as far as it is in the right nature of man to go. They were gentlemen in the full sense of the word, and what has one not said in saying this? They seldom spoke of Ydgrun, or even alluded to her, but would never run counter to her dictates without ample reason for doing so. In such cases they would override her with due self-reliance, and the goddess seldom punished them. For they are brave, and Ydgrun is not. They had most of them a smattering of the hypothetical language, and some few more than this, but only a few. I do not think that this language has had much hand in making them what they are, but rather that the fact of their being generally possessed of its rudiments was one great reason for the reverence paid to the hypothetical language itself. Being inured from youth to exercises and athletics of all sorts, and living fearlessly under the eye of their peers, among whom there exists a high standard of courage, generosity, honour, and every good and manly quality, what wonder that they should have become, so to speak, a law unto themselves, and while taking an elevated view of the goddess Ydgrun, they should have gradually lost all faith in the recognized deities of the country. These they do not openly disregard, for conformity, until absolutely intolerable, is a law of Ydgrun, yet they have no real belief in the objective existence of beings which so readily explain themselves as abstractions, and whose personality demands a quasi-materialism which it baffles the imagination to realize. They keep their opinions, however, greatly to themselves, inasmuch as most of their countrymen feel strongly about the gods, and they hold it wrong to give pain unless for some greater good than seems likely to arise from their plain speaking. On the other hand, surely those whose own minds are clear about any given matter, even though it be only that there is little certainty, should go so far towards imparting that clearness to others as to say openly what they think and why they think it, whenever they can properly do so, for they may be sure that they owe their own clearness almost entirely to the fact that others have done this by them. After all, they may be mistaken, and if so, it is for their own and the general well-being that they should let their error be seen as distinctly as possible, so that it may be more easily refuted. I own, therefore, that on this one point I disapproved of the practice even of the highest Ydgrunites, and objected to it all the more because I knew that I should find my own future task more easy if the high Ydgrunites had already undermined the belief which is supposed to prevail at present. In other respects they were more like the best class of Englishmen than any whom I have seen in other countries. I should have liked to have persuaded half a dozen of them to come over to England and go upon the stage, for they had most of them a keen sense of humour and a taste for acting. They would be of great use to us. The example of a real gentleman is, if I may say so without profanity, the best of all gospels. Such a man upon the stage becomes a potent humanizing influence, an ideal which all may look upon for a shilling. I always liked and admired these men, and although I could not help deeply regretting their certain ultimate perdition, for they had no sense of a hereafter, and their only religion was that of self-respect and consideration for other people, I never dared to take so great a liberty with them as to attempt to put them in possession of my own religious convictions, in spite of my knowing that they were the only ones which could make them really good and happy, either here or hereafter. I did try sometimes, being impelled to do so by a strong sense of duty, and by my deep regret that so much that was admirable should be doomed to ages if not eternity of torture. but the words stuck in my throat as soon as I began. Whether a professional missionary might have a better chance, I know not. Such persons must doubtless know more about the science of conversion. For myself, I could only be thankful that I was on the right path, and was obliged to let others take their chance as yet. If the plan fails, by which I propose to convert them myself, I would gladly contribute my mite towards the sending 2 or 3 trained missionaries, who have been known as successful converters of Jews and Mahometans. But such have seldom much to glory in the flesh, and when I think of the high Idgrunites, and of the figure which a missionary would probably cut among them, I cannot feel sanguine that much good would be arrived at. Still, the attempt is worth making, and the worst danger to the missionaries themselves would be that of being sent to the hospital where Chowbok would have been sent had he come with me into Erewhon. Taking, then, their religious opinions as a whole, I must own that the Erewhonians are superstitious, on account of the views which they hold of their professed gods, and their entirely anomalous and inexplicable worship of Idgrun, a worship at once the most powerful yet most devoid of formalism that I ever met with. But in practice things worked better than might have been expected, and the conflicting claims of Idgrun and the gods were arranged by unwritten compromises, for the most part in Idgrun's favor, which in 99 cases out of 100 were very well understood. I could not conceive why they should not openly acknowledge high Idgrunism, and discard the objective personality of hope, justice, etc., but whenever I so much as hinted at this, I found that I was on dangerous ground. They would never have it, returning constantly to the assertion that ages ago the divinities were frequently seen, and that the moment their personality was disbelieved in, men would leave off practicing even those ordinary virtues which the common experience of mankind has agreed on as being the greatest secret of happiness. Who ever heard, they ask indignantly, of such things as kindly training, a good example, and an enlightened regard to one's own welfare, being able to keep men straight? In my hurry, forgetting things which I ought to have remembered, I answered that if a person could not be kept straight by these things, there was nothing that could straighten him, and that if he were not ruled by the love and fear of men whom he had seen, neither would he be so by that of the gods whom he had not seen. At one time, indeed, I came upon a small but growing sect who believed, after a fashion, in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection from the dead. They taught that those who had been born with feeble and diseased bodies, and had passed their lives in ailing, would be tortured eternally hereafter, but that those who had been born strong and healthy and handsome would be rewarded for ever and ever. Of moral qualities or conduct they made no mention. Bad as this was, it was a step in advance, inasmuch as they did hold out a future state of some sort, and I was shocked to find that for the most part they met with opposition, on the score that their doctrine was based upon no sort of foundation, also that it was immoral in its tendency, and not to be desired by any reasonable beings. When I asked how it could be immoral, I was answered that if firmly held, it would lead people to cheapen this present life, making it appear to be an affair of only secondary importance, that it would thus distract men's minds from the perfecting of this world's economy, and was an impatient cutting, so to speak, of the Gordian knot of life's problems, whereby some people might gain present satisfaction to themselves at the cost of infinite damage to others; that the doctrine tended to encourage the poor in their improvidence, and in a debasing acquiescence in ills which they might well remedy; that the rewards were illusory, and the result, after all, of luck, whose empire should be bounded by the grave; that its terrors were enervating and unjust, and that even the most blessed rising would be but the disturbing of a still more blessed slumber. To all which I could only say that the thing had been actually known to happen, and that there were several well authenticated instances of people having died and come to life again, instances which no man in his senses could doubt. "If this be so," said my opponent, "we must bear it as best we may." I then translated for him as well as I could the noble speech of Hamlet, in which he says that it is the fear lest worse evils may befall us after death which alone prevents us from rushing into death's arms. Nonsense, he answered. No man was ever yet stopped from cutting his throat by any such fears as your poet ascribes to him, and your poet probably knew this perfectly well. If a man cuts his throat, he is at bay, and thinks of nothing but escape, no matter whither, provided he can shuffle off his present. No, men are kept at their posts, not by the fear that if they quit them they may quit a frying pan for a fire, but by the hope that if they hold on, the fire may burn less fiercely. The respect, to quote your poet, that makes calamity so long a life, is the consideration that though calamity may live long, the sufferer may live longer still. On this, seeing that there was little probability of our coming to an agreement, I let the argument drop, and my opponent presently left me with as much disapprobation as he could show without being overtly rude. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Erewhon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ernst Patinama. Chapter 18. Birth Formulae. I heard what follows not from Erewhon, but from Mr. Nosnibor, and some of the gentlemen who occasionally dined at the house. They told me that the Erewhonians believe in pre-existence, and not only this, of which I will write more fully in the next chapter, but they believe that it is of their own free act and deed in a previous state that they come to be born into this world at all. They hold that the unborn are perpetually plaguing and tormenting the married of both sexes, fluttering about them incessantly, and giving them no peace, either of mind or body, until they have consented to take them under their protection. If this were not so, this at least is what they urge, it would be a monstrous freedom for one man to take with another, to say that he should undergo the chances and changes of this mortal life without any option in the matter. No man would have any right to get married at all, inasmuch as he can never tell what frightful misery his doing so may entail forcibly upon a being who cannot be unhappy as long as he does not exist. They feel this so strongly that they are resolved to shift the blame on to other shoulders, and have fashioned a long mythology as to the world in which the unborn people live, and what they do, and the arts and machinations to which they have recourse, in order to get themselves into our own world. But of this more anon. What I would relate here is their manner of dealing with those who do come. It is a distinguishing peculiarity of the Erewhonians that when they profess themselves to be quite certain about any matter, and avow it as a base on which they are to build a system of practice, they seldom quite believe in it. If they smell a rat about the precincts of a cherished institution, they will always stop their noses to it, if they can. This is what most of them did in this matter of the unborn, for I cannot, and never could, think that they seriously believed in their mythology concerning pre-existence. They did, and they did not. They did not know themselves what they believed. All they did know was that it was a disease not to believe as they did. The only thing of which they were quite sure was that it was the pestering of the unborn which caused them to be brought into this world, and that they would not have been here if they would have only let peaceable people alone. It would be hard to disprove this position, and they might have a good case if they would only leave it as it stands. But this they will not do. They must have assurance doubly sure. They must have the written word of the child itself as soon as it is born, giving the parents indemnity from all responsibility on the score of its birth, and asserting its own pre-existence. They have therefore devised something which they call a birth formula, a document which varies in words according to the caution of parents, but is much the same practically in all cases, for it has been the business of the Erewhonian lawyers during many ages to exercise their skill in perfecting it and providing for every contingency. These formulae are printed on common paper at a moderate cost for the poor, but the rich have them written on parchment and handsomely bound, so that the getting up of a person's birth formula is a test of his social position. They commence by setting forth that whereas A.B. was a member of the kingdom of the unborn, where he was well provided for in every way, and had no cause of discontent, etc., etc., he did of his own wanton depravity and restlessness conceive a desire to enter into this present world, that thereon having taken the necessary steps as set forth in laws of the unborn kingdom, he did, with malice aforethought, set himself to plague and pester two unfortunate people who had never wronged him, and who were quite contented and happy until he conceived this base design against their peace, for which wrong he now humbly entreats their pardon. He acknowledges that he is responsible for all physical blemishes and deficiencies which may render him answerable to the laws of his country, that his parents have nothing whatever to do with any of these things, and that they have a right to kill him at once if they be so minded, though he entreats them to show their marvellous goodness and clemency by sparing his life. If they will do this, he promises to be their most obedient and abject creature during his earlier years, and indeed all his life, unless they should see fit in their abundant generosity to remit some portion of his service hereafter. And so the formula continues, going sometimes into very minute details, according to the fancies of family lawyers, who will not make it any shorter than they can help. The deed being thus prepared, on the third or fourth day after the birth of the child, or as they call it, the final importunity, the friends gather together, and there is a feast held, where they are all very melancholy, as a general rule, I believe, quite truly so, and make presents to the father and mother of the child, in order to console them for the injury which has just been done them by the unborn. By and by the child himself is brought down by his nurse, and the company begin to rail upon him, upbraiding him for his impertinence, and asking him what amends he proposes to make for the wrong that he has committed, and how he can look for care and nourishment from those who have perhaps already been injured by the unborn on some 10 or 12 occasions, for they say of people with large families that they have suffered terrible injuries from the unborn, till at last, when this has been carried far enough, some one suggests the formula, which is brought out and solemnly read to the child by the family straightener. This gentleman is always invited on these occasions, for the very fact of intrusion into a peaceful family shows a depravity on the part of the child which requires his professional services. On being teased by the reading and tweaked by the nurse, the child will commonly begin to cry, which is reckoned a good sign, as showing a consciousness of guilt. He is thereon asked, does he assent to the formula? On which, as he still continues crying, and can obviously make no answer, some one of the friends comes forward and undertakes to sign the document on his behalf, feeling sure, so he says, that the child would do it if he only knew how, and that he will release the present signer from his engagement on arriving at maturity. The friend then inscribes the signature of the child at the foot of the parchment, which is held to bind the child as much as though he had signed it himself. Even this, however, does not fully content them, for they feel a little uneasy until they have got the child's own signature after all. So when he is about 14, these good people partly bribe him by promises of greater liberty and good things, and partly intimidate him through their great power of making themselves actively unpleasant to him, so that, though there is a show of freedom made, there is really none. They also use the offices of the teachers in the colleges of unreason, till at last, in one way or another, they take very good care that he shall sign the paper for which he professes to have been a free agent in coming into the world, and to take all the responsibility of having done so on to his own shoulders. And yet, though this document is obviously the most important which anyone can sign in his whole life, they will have him do so at an age when neither they nor the law will, for many a year, allow anyone else to bind him to the smallest obligation, no matter how righteously he may owe it, because they hold him too young to know what he is about, and do not consider it fair that he should commit himself to anything that may prejudice him in after years. I own that all this seemed rather hard, and not of a piece with the many admirable institutions existing among them. I once ventured to say a part of what I thought about it to one of the professors of unreason. I did it very tenderly, but his justification of the system was quite out of my comprehension. I remember asking him whether he did not think it would do harm to a lad's principles, by weakening his sense of the sanctity of his word and of truth generally, that he should be led into entering upon a solemn declaration as to the truth of things, about which all that he can certainly know is that he knows nothing, whether, in fact, the teachers who so led him, or who taught anything as a certainty, of which they were themselves uncertain, were not earning their living by impairing the truth-sense of their pupils, a delicate organization mostly, and by vitiating one of the most sacred instincts. The professor, who was a delightful person, seemed greatly surprised at the view which I took, but it had no influence with him whatsoever. No one, he answered, expected that the boy either would or could know all that he said he knew, but the world was full of compromises, and there was hardly any affirmation which would bear being interpreted literally. Human language was too gross a vehicle of thought, thought being incapable of absolute translation. He added that as there can be no translation from one language into another which shall not scant the meaning somewhat, or enlarge upon it, so there is no language which can render thought without a jarring and a harshness somewhere, and so forth, all of which seemed to come to this in the end, that it was the custom of the country, and that the Erewhonians were a conservative people, that the boy would have to begin compromising sooner or later, and this was part of his education in the art. It was perhaps to be regretted that compromise should be as necessary as it was. Still it was necessary, and the sooner the boy got to understand it, the better for himself. But they never tell this to the boy. From the book of their mythology about the unborn, I made the extracts which will form the following chapter. End of chapter 18. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands.
Erewhon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Neil Donnelly. Erewhon by Samuel Butler, Chapter 19, The World of the Unborn. The Erewhonians say that we are drawn through life backwards, or again that we go onwards into the future as into a dark corridor. Time walks beside us and flings back shutters as we advance, but the light thus given often dazzles us and deepens the darkness which is in front. We can see but little at a time, and heed that little far less than our apprehension of what we shall see next, ever peering curiously through the glare of the present into the gloom of the future. We presage the leading lines of that which is before us by faintly reflected lights from dull mirrors that are behind, and stumble on as we may till the trap door opens beneath us, and we are gone. They say at other times that the future and the past are as a panorama upon two rollers. That which is on the roller of the future unwraps itself on to the roller of the past. We cannot hasten it, and we may not stay it. We must see all that is unfolded to us, whether it be good or ill, and what we have seen once we may see again no more. It is ever unwinding and being wound. We catch it in transition for a moment and call it present. Our flustered senses gather what impression they can, and we guess at what is coming by the tenor of that which we have seen. The same hand has painted the whole picture, and the incidents vary little. Rivers, woods, plains, mountains, towns and peoples, love, sorrow, and death, yet the interest never flags, and we look hopefully for some good fortune, or fearfully lest our own faces be shown us as figuring in something terrible. When the scene is past we think we know it, though there is so much to see, and so little time to see it, that our conceit of knowledge as regards the past is for the most part poorly founded. Neither do we care about it greatly, save in so far as it may affect the future, wherein our interest mainly lies. The Erewhonians say it was by chance only that the earth and stars and all the heavenly worlds began to roll from east to west, and not from west to east, and in like manner they say it is by chance that man is drawn through life with his face to the past instead of to the future. For the future is there as much as the past, only that we may not see it. Is it not in the loins of the past, and must not the past alter before the future can do so? Sometimes again they say that there was a race of men tried upon the earth once, who knew the future better than the past, but that they died in a 12-month from the misery which their knowledge caused them. And if any were to be born too prescient now, he would be culled out by natural selection, before he had time to transmit so peace-destroying a faculty to his descendants. Strange fate for man! He must perish if he get that, which he must perish if he strive not after. If he strive not after it, he is no better than the brutes. If he gets it, he is more miserable than the devils. Having waded through many chapters like the above, I came at last to the unborn themselves, and found that they were held to be souls, pure and simple, having no actual bodies, but living in a sort of gaseous yet more or less anthropomorphic existence, like that of a ghost. They have thus neither flesh nor blood nor warmth. Nevertheless, they are supposed to have local habitations and cities wherein they dwell, though these are as unsubstantial as their inhabitants. They are even thought to eat and drink some thin ambrosial sustenance, and generally to be capable of doing whatever mankind can do, only after a visionary ghostly fashion, as in a dream. On the other hand, as long as they remain where they are, they never die, the only form of death in the unborn world being the leaving of it for our own. They are believed to be extremely numerous, far more so than mankind. They arrive from unknown planets, full grown, in large batches at a time, but they can only leave the unborn world by taking the steps necessary for their arrival here, which is in fact by suicide. They ought to be an exceedingly happy people, for they have no extremes of good or ill fortune, never marrying, but living in a state much like that fabled by the poets as the primitive condition of mankind. In spite of this, however, they are incessantly complaining. They know that we in this world have bodies, and indeed they know everything else about us, for they move among us whithersoever they will, and can read our thoughts as well as survey our actions at pleasure. One would think that this should be enough for them, and most of them are indeed alive to the desperate risk which they will run by indulging themselves in that body with sensible warm motion which they so much desire. Nevertheless, there are some to whom the ennui of a disembodied existence is so intolerable that they will venture anything for a change. So they resolve to quit. The conditions which they must accept are so uncertain that none but the most foolish of the unborn will consent to them, and it is from these, and these only, that our own ranks are recruited. When they have finally made up their minds to leave, they must go before the magistrate of the nearest town, and sign an affidavit of their desire to quit their then existence. On their having done this, the magistrate reads them the conditions which they must accept, and which are so long that I can only extract some of the principal points, which are mainly the following. First, they must take a potion which will destroy their memory and sense of identity. They must go into the world helpless, and without a will of their own. They must draw lots for their dispositions before they go, and take them, such as they are, for better or worse. Neither are they to be allowed any choice in the matter of the body which they so much desire. They are simply allotted by chance, and without appeal, to two people whom it is their business to find and pester until they adopt them. Who these are to be, whether rich or poor, kind or unkind, healthy or diseased, there is no knowing. They have in fact to entrust themselves for many years to the care of those for whose good constitution and good sense they have no sort of guarantee. It is curious to read the lectures which the wiser heads give to those who are meditating a change. They talk with them as we talk with a spendthrift, and with about as much success. To be born, they say, is a felony. It is a capital crime, for which sentence may be executed at any moment after the commission of the offence. You may perhaps happen to live for some 70 or 80 years, but what is that compared with the eternity you now enjoy? And even though the sentence were commuted, and you were allowed to live on forever, you would in time become so terribly weary of life that execution would be the greatest mercy to you. Consider the infinite risk. To be born of wicked parents and trained to vice, to be born of silly parents and trained to unrealities, of parents who regard you as a sort of chattel or property belonging more to them than to yourself. Again, you may draw utterly unsympathetic parents who will never be able to understand you, and who will do their best to thwart you, as a hen when she has hatched a duckling, and then call you ungrateful because you do not love them. Or again, you may draw parents who look upon you as a thing to be cowed while it is still young, lest it should give them trouble hereafter by having wishes and feelings of its own. In later life, when you have been finally allowed to pass muster as a full member of the world, you will yourself become liable to the pesterings of the unborn, and a very happy life you may be led in consequence. For we solicit so strongly that a few only, nor these the best, can refuse us. And yet not to refute is much the same as going into partnership with half a dozen different people about whom one can know absolutely nothing beforehand, not even whether one is going into partnership with men or women, nor with how many of either. Delude not yourself with thinking that you will be wiser than your parents. You may be an age in advance of those whom you have pestered, but unless you are one of the great ones, you will still be an age behind those who will in their turn pester you. Imagine what it must be to have an unborn quartered upon you, who is of an entirely different temperament and disposition to your own, nay, half a dozen such, who will not love you, though you have stinted yourself in 1,000 ways to provide for their comfort and well-being, who will forget all your self-sacrifice, and of whom you may never be sure that they are not bearing a grudge against you for errors of judgment into which you may have fallen, though you had hoped that such had been long since atoned for. Ingratitude such as this is not uncommon, yet fancy what it must be to bear. It is hard upon the duckling to have been hatched by a hen, but is it not also hard upon the hen to have hatched the duckling? Consider again, we pray you, not for our sake, but for your own. Your initial character you must draw by lot, but whatever it is, it can only come to a tolerably successful development after long training. Remember that over that training you will have no control. It is possible, and even probable, that whatever you may get in after life which is of real pleasure and service to you, will have to be won in spite of, rather than by the help of, those whom you are now about to pester, and that you will only win your freedom after years of a painful struggle, in which it will be hard to say whether you have suffered most injury or inflicted it. Remember also that if you go into the world you will have free will, that you will be obliged to have it, that there is no escaping it, that you will be fettered to it during your whole life, and must on every occasion do that which on the whole seems best to you at any given time, no matter whether you are right or wrong in choosing it. Your mind will be a balance for considerations, and your actions will go with the heavier scale. How it shall fall will depend upon the kind of scales which you may have drawn at birth, and if they have not been outrageously tampered with in childhood, and if the combinations into which you enter are average ones, you may come off well, but there are too many ifs in this, and with the failure of any one of them your misery is assured. Reflect on this, and remember that should the ill come upon you, you will have yourself to thank, for it is your own choice to be born, and there is no compulsion in the matter. Not that we deny the existence of pleasures among mankind. There is a certain show of sundry phases of contentment which may even amount to a very considerable happiness, but mark how they are distributed over a man's life, belonging all the keenest of them to the fore part, and few indeed to the after. Can there be any pleasure worth purchasing with the miseries of a decrepit age? If you are good, strong, and handsome, you have a fine fortune indeed at 20, but how much of it will be left at 60? For you must live on your capital. There is no investing your powers so that you may get a small annuity of life forever. You must eat up your principal bit by bit, and be tortured by seeing it grow continually smaller and smaller, even though you happen to escape being rudely robbed of it by crime or casualty. Remember, too, that there never yet was a man of 40 who would not come back into the world of the unborn if he could do so with decency and honor. Being in the world, he will as a general rule stay till he is forced to go. But do you think he would consent to be born again, and relive his life if he had the offer of doing so? Do not think it. If he could so alter the past as that he should never have come into being at all, do you not think that he would do it very gladly? What was it that one of their own poets meant, if it was not this, when he cried out upon the day in which he was born, and the night in which it was said there is a man-child conceived? For now, he says, I should have lain still and been quiet, I should have slept. Then had I been at rest with kings and counsellors of the earth, which built desolate places for themselves, or with princes that had gold, who filled their houses with silver, or as an hidden untimely birth, I had not been, as infants which never saw light. There the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. Be very sure that the guilt of being born carries this punishment at all times to all men. But how can they ask for pity, or complain of any mischief that may befall them, having entered open-eyed into the snare? One word more, and we have done. If any faint remembrance, as of a dream, flit in some puzzled moment across your brain, and you shall feel that the potion which is to be given you shall not have done its work, and the memory of this existence which you are leaving endeavours vainly to return, we say in such a moment, when you clutch at the dream but it eludes your grasp, and you watch it, as Orpheus watched Eurydice gliding back again into the twilight kingdom, fly, fly, if you can remember the advice, to the haven of your present and immediate duty, taking shelter incessantly in the work which you have in hand. This much you may perhaps recall, and this, if you will imprint it deeply upon your every faculty, will be most likely to bring you safely and honorably home through the trials that are before you. This is the fashion in which they reason with those who would be for leaving them, but it is seldom that they do much good, for none but the unquiet and unreasonable ever think of being born, and those who are foolish enough to think of it are generally foolish enough to do it. Finding, therefore, that they can do no more, the friends follow weeping to the court-house of the chief magistrate, where the one who wishes to be born declares solemnly and openly that he accepts the conditions attached to his decisions. On this he is presented with a potion, which immediately destroys his memory and sense of identity, and dissipates the thin gaseous tenement which he has inhabited. He becomes a bare vital principle, not to be perceived by human senses, nor to be by any chemical test appreciated. He has but one instinct, which is that he is to go to such and such a place, where he will find two persons whom he is to importune till they consent to undertake him. But whether he is to find these persons among the race of Chowbok or the Erewhonians themselves is not for him to choose. End of chapter 19.
Of Erewhon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hannah Dowell. Erewhon by Samuel Butler. Chapter 20. What they mean by it. I have given the above mythology at some length, but it is only a small part of what they have upon the subject. My first feeling on reading it was that any amount of folly on the part of the unborn in coming here was justified by a desire to escape from such intolerable prosing. The mythology is obviously an unfair and exaggerated representation of life and things, and had its authors been so minded, they could have easily drawn a picture which would err as much on the bright side as this does on the dark. No Erewhonian believes that the world is as black as it has here been painted, but it is one of their peculiarities that they very often do not believe or mean things which they profess to regard as indisputable. In the present instance, their professed views concerning the unborn have arisen from their desire to prove that people have been presented with the gloomiest possible picture of their own prospects before they came here. Otherwise, they could hardly say to one whom they are going to punish for an affection of the heart or brain that it is all his own doing. In practice, they modify their theory to a considerable extent, and seldom refer to the birth formula except in extreme cases, for the force of habit, or what not, gives many of them a kindly interest even in creatures who have so much wrong to them as the unborn have done. And though a man generally hates the unwelcome little stranger for the first 12 months, he is apt to mollify, according to his lights, as time goes on, and sometimes he will become inordinately attached to the beings whom he is pleased to call his children. Of course, according to Erewhonian premises, it would serve people right to be punished and scouted for moral and intellectual diseases as much as for physical, and I cannot to this day understand why they should have stopped short half-way. Neither again can I understand why their having done so should have been, as it certainly was, a matter of so much concern to myself. What could it matter to me how many absurdities the Erewhonians might adopt? Nevertheless, I longed to make them think as I did, for the wish to spread these opinions that we hold conducive to our own welfare is so deeply rooted in the English character that few of us can escape its influence. But let this pass. In spite of not a few modifications in practice of a theory, which is itself revolting, the relations between children and parents in that country are less happy than in Europe. It was rarely that I saw cases of real hearty and intense affection between old people and the young ones. Here and there I did so, and was quite sure about the children, even at the age of 20, were fonder of their parents than they were of anyone else, and that of their own inclination, being free to choose what company they would often choose that of their father and mother. The straightener's carriage was rarely seen at the door of those houses. I saw 2 or 3 such cases during the time that I remained in the country, and cannot express the pleasure which I derived from a sight suggestive of so much goodness and wisdom and forbearance so richly rewarded. Yet I firmly believe that the same thing would happen in 9 families out of 10 if the parents were merely to remember how they felt when they were young, and actually behave towards their children as they would have had their own parents behave towards them. But this, which would appear to be so simple and obvious, seems also to be a thing which not 1 in 100,000 is able to put in practice. It is only the very great and good who have made any living faith in the simplest axioms, and there are few who are so holy as to feel that 19 and 13 make 32, as certainly as 2 and 2 make 4. I am quite sure that if this narrative should ever fall into Erewhonian hands, it will be said that what I have written about the relations between parents and children being seldom satisfactory is an infamous perversion of facts, and that, in truth, there are few young people who do not feel happier in the society of their nearest relations than in any other. Mr. Nosnibor would be sure to say this, yet I cannot refrain from expressing an opinion that he would be a good deal embarrassed if his deceased parents were to appear and propose to pay him a 6 months' visit. I doubt whether there are many things which he would regard as greater infliction. They had died at a ripe old age some 20 years before I came to know him, so the case is an extreme one. But surely, if they had treated him with what in his youth he had felt to be true unselfishness, his face would brighten when he thought of them to the end of his life. In the 1 or 2 cases of true family affection which I met with, I am sure that the young people who were so genuinely fond of their fathers and mothers at 18 would at 60 be perfectly delighted were they to get the chance of welcoming them as their guests. There is nothing which could please them better, except perhaps to watch the happiness of their own children and grandchildren. This is how things should be. It is not an impossible ideal. It is one which actually does exist in some few cases, and might exist in almost all, with a little more patience and forbearance upon the parents' part. But it is rare at present, so rare that they have a proverb which I can only translate in a very roundabout way, but which says that the great happiness of some people in the future state will consist in watching the distress of their parents on returning to eternal companionship with their grandfathers and grandmothers, whilst compulsory affection is the idea which lies at the root of their word for the deepest anguish. There is no talisman in the word parent, which can generate miracles of affection, and I can well believe that my own child might find it less of a calamity to lose both Erewhona and myself when he is 6 years old, than to find us again when he is 60. A sentence which I would not pen did I not feel that by doing so I was giving him something like a hostage, or at any rate putting a weapon into his hands against me, should my selfishness exceed reasonable limits. Money is at the bottom of all of this to a great extent. If the parents would put their children in the way of earning a competence earlier than they do, the children would soon become self-supporting and independent. As it is, under the present system, the young ones get old enough to have all manner of legitimate wants, that is, if they have any go about them, before they have learnt the means of earning money to pay for them. Hence, they must either do without them, or take more money than the parents can be expected to spare. This is due chiefly to the schools of unreason, where a boy is taught upon hypothetical principles, as I will explain hereafter, spending years in being incapacitated for doing this, that, or the other, he hardly knows what, during all which time he ought to have been actually doing the thing itself, beginning at the lowest grades, picking it up through actual practice, and rising according to the energy which is in him. These schools of unreason surprised me much. It would be easy to fall into pseudo-utilitarianism, and I would fain believe that the system may be good for the children of very rich parents, or for those who show a natural instinct to acquire hypothetical law, but the misery was their Jungdren worship required all people with any pretence to respectability to send the children to some one or other of these schools, mulcting them of years of money. It astonished me to see what sacrifices the parents would make in order to render their children as nearly useless as possible, and it was hard to say whether the old suffered most from the expense with which they were thus put to, or the young from being deliberately swindled in some of the most important branches of human inquiry, and directed into false channels, or left to drift in the great majority of cases. I cannot think that I am mistaken in believing that the growing tendency to limit families by infanticide, an evil which was causing general alarm throughout the country, was almost entirely due to the way in which education had become a fetish from one end of Erewhon to the other. Granted that provision should be made whereby every child should be taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, but here compulsory state-aided education should end, and the child should begin, with all due precautions to ensure that he is not overworked, to acquire the rudiments of that art whereby he is to earn his living. He cannot acquire these in what we in England call schools of technical education. Such schools are cloister life, as against the rough and tumble of the world. They unfit, rather than fit, for work in the open. An art can only be learned in the workshop of those who are winning their bread by it. Boys, as a rule, hate the artificial and delight in the actual. Give them the chance of earning, and they will soon earn. When parents find that their children, instead of being made artificially burdensome, will early begin to contribute to the well-being of the family, they will soon leave off killing them, and will seek to have that plenitude of offspring which they now avoid. As things are, the state lays greater burdens on parents than flesh and blood can bear, and then wrings its hands over an evil for which it is itself mainly responsible. With the less well-dressed classes the harm was not so great, for among these, at about 10 years old, the child has to begin doing something. If he is capable, he makes his way up. If he is not, he is at any rate not made more incapable by what his friends are pleased to call his education. People find their level as a rule, and though they are unfortunately sometimes miss it, it is in the main true that those who have valuable qualities are perceived to have them and can sell them. I think that the Erewhonians are beginning to become aware of these things, for there was much talk about putting tax upon all parents whose children were not earning a competence according to their degrees by the time they were 20 years old. I am sure that if they will have the courage to carry it through, they will never regret it, for the parents will take care that the children shall begin earning money, which means doing good to society, at an early age. Then the children will be independent early, and they will not press on the parents, nor the parents on them, and they will like each other better than they do now. This is the true philanthropy. He who makes a colossal fortune in the hosiery trade, and by his energy succeeded in reducing the price of woolen goods by the thousandth part of a penny in the pound, this man is worth 10 professional philanthropists. So strongly are the Erewhonians impressed with this, that if a man has made a fortune of over 20,000 a year, they exempt him from all taxation, considering him as a work of art, and too precious to be meddled with. They say, "How very much he must have done for society before society could have been prevailed upon to give him so much money." So magnificent an organisation overawes them. They regard it as a thing dropped from heaven. Money, they say, is the symbol of duty. It is the sacrament of having done for mankind that which mankind wanted. Mankind might not be a very good judge, but there is no better. This used to shock me at first, when I remembered that it had been said on high authority that they who have riches shall enter hardly into the kingdom of heaven. But the influence of Erewhon had made me begin to see things in a new light, and I could not help thinking that they who have not riches shall enter more hardy still. People oppose money to culture, and imply that if a man has spent his time in making money, he will not be cultivated. Fallacy of fallacies! As though there could be a greater aid to culture than the having earned an honourable independence, and as though any amount of culture will do match the man who is penniless, except make him feel his position more deeply. The young man, who was told to sell all his goods and give to the poor, must have been an entirely exceptional person if the advice was given wisely, either for him or for the poor. How much more often does it happen that we perceive a man to have all sorts of good qualities, except money, and feel that his real duty lies in getting every halfpenny that he can persuade others to pay him for his services, and becoming rich. It has been said that the love of money is the root of all evil. The want of money is so quite as truly. The above may sound irreverent, but it is conceived in a spirit of the most utter reverence for those things which do alone deserve it, that is, for the things which mould us and fashion us, be they what they may, for the things that have the power to punish us, and which will punish us if we do not heed them, for our masters, therefore. But I am drifting away from my story. They have another plan, about which they are making a great noise and fuss, much as some are doing with women's rights in England. A party of extreme radicals have professed themselves unable to decide upon the superiority of age or youth. At present, all goes on the supposition that it is desirable to make the young old as soon as possible. Some would have it that this is wrong, and that the object of education should be to keep the old young as long as possible. They say that each age should take its turn about week by week. 1 week to the old to be topsawyers, and the other the young, drawing the line at 35 years of age, but they insist that the young should be allowed to inflict corporal chastisement on the old, without which the old would be quite incorrigible. In any European country this would be out of the question, but it is not so here, for the straighteners are constantly ordering people to be flogged, so that they are familiar with the notion. I do not suppose that the idea will ever be acted upon, but its having been even mooted is enough to show the utter perversion of the Erewhonian mind. End of chapter 20. Recording by Hannah Dowell.